All right, I am with Jesse and Amanda from the Typecast Heroes, and they are here to save us by typing us and all those things that they do. Um, they were actually my second guest as an official podcast back in July when this launched, and it's a real honor to have them on again. I've been somewhat keeping up with their work, although it's a lot to keep up with in a good way. So one reason I wanted to do this about now is because when we left off back in July, they were anticipating this huge project that they've been working on now since February. So part of it is I just want to get an update on that and then just talk about some of these things like introversion, extroversion, and all these weird, quirky things that go into personalities. So without much ado, Jesse and Amanda, tell us what's going on, what you've been up to, and what's going on with your project right now.
So we just released the INTP data, and rumor has it that you're an INTP. You got like typed, even though we had that conversation.
Yes, the rumor is true. Yes, I can't deny it anymore.
I know, I didn't think so. So these are your people, right? The INTPs. And the reason that I chose to release these first is because they were the first group to hit 100. And actually it was 141 who ended up being in the official study.
Right.
So it was pretty, it was a lot of data to go through. It was a lot of math, a lot of statistics, a lot of spreadsheet work. It was insane. But the INTP data just came out. I'm still working on some of the other types of collecting enough because I wanted 100 of each type. So extroverted sensors, I need them so badly. The ESTPs, ESTJs, ESFJs, and ESFPs. And then really everybody else is over 100 or right at it. So it's been pretty insane.
How many do you have in those negligent categories? Or how approximately how short are you?
About under half 100. On some
of them. Really? Wow. What's up with the ESs?
Living life. From what I've been told, whenever I ask in like Reddit or something like that, that's pretty much the response I get, is that they are, for one, there's an idea that they don't really join MBTI groups because particularly the ESFJs and ESTJs are some of the most populous groups, and being extroverts, they're more action oriented, so they're not as likely to spend as much time trying to connect with people on Facebook or MBTI groups in general. And then also there's this nice idea that they may not be as, introverts in general tend to spend more time introspecting and trying to figure out why they are a certain way when they're younger. And so the online community really is heavy with the introverted types. The extroverted types not so much. And that might be because like when they are getting into that introspection process, it's later in life and it may not be necessarily intuitive to them to go ahead and join Facebook.
So statistically, it's not that there's less of the ESs, it's just that they're not in the circles that you're running with. I think the alternative theory that I come up with in my intuition is that they're kind of, extroverts are kind of going nuts right now more than us introverts, I guess. So that might be part of it, but I don't know. Maybe they would like it, and if you can find them when they're not like climbing the walls or ripping down wallpaper or anything, is they would probably like it once they figure out what it is, that it's something to where they can talk to someone for a while. So yeah, you just got to figure out how to get to them, I guess.
Yeah, at this point, we're really heavily relying on word of mouth, really, because again, most of the Facebook groups, they're, I mean, there's been plenty of posts in there with Jesse asking for them to come out and talk, and we do have a few of them that we're pretty close to, and so they're reaching out to some of their buddies, and that's always helpful. But yeah, just finding them and giving us that time, like a certain amount of time of their day and their energy to sit down and do the project has been.
Yeah, because it seems like all the S types that I know, that you're right, they're either introverted, or if they're the extroverted, they are it's hard to get them to sit down and do anything. they're like all over the place.
The funny thing is that I started looking for ESTPs. They were the second group I started looking for in March. And so that's been what, 9 months that I've been looking, and they still are not, I've spoken to probably close to 100 ESTPs. I type them fairly often. Like when people come to us for type clarification, I work with a client. I've gotten a lot of ESTPs, but it's like they kind of ghost a little bit. They don't finish the process, or they don't want to participate in the project.
Like they came for a reason.
All right, so that's basically 3 out of the 16 that you're having issues with. But how long is it going to take you roughly to finish the others?
So the intuitives are done, and then ISTP I will finish today, and then ISFP probably will be finished within the next 2 weeks. ISFJ and ISTJ within the next maybe 6 weeks, by the end of February.
All right, so you got a little time to dig up those, but that's still like over 100 to come up with, so it'll be tricky.
Fairly,
what's that?
I mean, you're at 1,500 total out of 1,600. So, and like in total for the entire project to be done, it's right around 100 more people with all of it put together.
Right.
So super, super, super close. Out of 1,600, it's pretty awesome.
Kind of. That, like, so the 1,500 who are participated, that's counting the overflow.
Right.
So like some of the types are still at a deficit, but it's not so bad. Like there's been days, like for instance, when I needed ENTJs, I posted in Reddit and I think I had 60 participate in one day. So it's also a luck thing, because some of these groups, it depends on when they're looking. So like I would post, I posted in the ISTJ group, gosh, I posted maybe 7 times since February. And sometimes when I post, I get nothing. And sometimes I get like 40 people. So it just depends. And then just because somebody agrees to interview doesn't mean that they will or they'll finish it. Right. Or they may not qualify and I may have to throw it out. So that's something else to take into consideration. Some of it's just luck.
Yeah. And I think it's just tricky too with COVID, because one thing that I've noticed interacting with people more online during COVID is it kind of has its waves where, like, I think there's some periods of time where it's like everybody wants to just be on Facebook or something, and there's other times when it's like people don't want to touch it. So I guess you just got to be diligent, but you'll get there. But now that you're almost done with it, are you able to kind of paint a clearer picture of like what you're trying to accomplish and how that this project's going to save the world?
Yeah. So when you look at the data for the INTPs, the first page that you see is the implications. If you look at it, and it talks about a lot of how this research could be applied to the education system. And so it's no secret, we say this in our video, like the video that we did covering the data, but it's no secret that INTPs struggle in the education system. And usually, usually that it's because people assume that perceivers in general, introverted perceivers, so like anybody who's got a P at the end of that letter is supposed to struggle. But incidentally, that's not what I've seen. The feeler types actually seem to do a lot better in education than the thinker types, which is interesting to me. And again, that's like personal self-reported stuff, but they seem to feel like they do better. But even beyond anecdotal, what people are telling me, one of the things that I think is most fascinating about my project is the way that they're able to do metacognitive skills, and the way that is very, very different. And so one of the implications that I talk about is with teachers who are not extroverted intuitives, and they're giving a student a question, particularly like to an INTP, and they ask them to look at a small concrete detail. INTPs may either not see why it's important because their brain doesn't work that way. They may not really understand the question. This is something that I pointed out a lot of, is when I would ask a direct question to an INTP and they would kind of like go all the way around it without ever actually answering what I was looking for. And I can see that very easily playing out into education. So if teachers understand that the child doesn't have a learning disability, they're not really ADHD, they're not trying to be defiant. If the teacher understands this about their student, then they can be better equipped to educate them, just like anything else that we should know about our students that we work with.
Well, and I would think too, like one thing that I was hoping to accomplish in this, whatever you want to call it, channel community that I'm sort of developing, but it's hard to really put in words because it's sort of general. But it's the idea that if someone is having trouble with a particular place, like that they're involved in, a group that they're involved in, whether that be a university or maybe even a high school or junior high, or a business or church, even a family, where there's a conflict of values. I think too often on the individual level, the trend is to just kind of like walk away from it. Even now, like Jordan Peterson and some others are all like, we need to like destroy the university system because they're so corrupt now. And that may be true to a certain degree, but I feel like what we can do, and this is kind of like changing the culture, not just changing the education system, but changing it kind of from the ground up, is help people figure out how that if they have teachers or a school environment that's not healthy, then how to get the most out of it anyway. And so, and a lot of that is going to be like what you're getting at, is understanding themselves and then understanding their teacher, because I think also the issue with the teachers is, you two work in education, so you know this better than most, that the real issue is a lot of times the bureaucracy, and not just because they have the government in them, but just they're that type of bureaucratic organization. So you can say, hey, look, we have to implement this stuff for a diverse range of personalities, and then if it gets done, it might take 5 or 10 years. So what I really see as positive from these implications and the things that I'm looking at the blog is how that it might take a while for things to adjust on the education system, especially like maybe some schools could do it sooner than others, but in the meantime, how one individual could better understand themselves and their classmates and the teachers and everything. And because especially because otherwise that's how like an INTP, for example, can easily be like, oh, everybody's stupid, it's the system's fault, it's my teacher's fault and everything, and that might be partially true, but it's a lot of times a conflict of personality. And so hopefully I think this will also help, it's helping people to see how to deal with those personality conflicts on an individual level, whether that's the school or the family or anything else. So
well, there's two things you said that I wanted to comment on.
Sure.
So the first one is, the funny thing is that the bureaucracy and the education system in the United States, with the invention of the gifted program, which has been around for a long time, they've already sort of acknowledged that thinking process for children who use extroverted intuition. So there's a study that I have linked, it's not mine, but I have linked in on our blog, where 10,000 children in the United States were surveyed, and they looked at who was gifted and who wasn't. And over half of their gifted students were extroverted intuitives. So they're acknowledging that, these children there's something different about the way that they think. They have something different about their intelligence levels or about what they focus on. So they've seen that. They know that. The problem is that they don't know what to do with it. So they literally just set them aside.
By the way, when you say extroverted intuitive, it's someone with that function as extroverted. So in other words,
first or second. So INTP, INFP, ENFP, or ENTP,
right,
all 4 types. It's the leading perceiving function.
Yeah.
So it could be.
So
that would count you.
That would count me. Okay, because I almost feel like I don't know, maybe at one point in the future, as this stuff becomes more mainstream, there might need to become some kind of vocabulary to simplify it, because it can get a little confusing, all the jumping around of like because like when you said that, for example, it's like extroverted intuitive. So does that mean like a EN, or does that mean an NE?
Oh, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Because I think people automatically assume that extroversion is going to start with an E, but the important thing that you learn through studying all this is that everyone has two extroverted functions and two introverted functions.
right.
And so it just depends on what you're leading with, but it can be definitely very confusing with
Yeah.
terminology.
Well, like I was spending time with my sister and her kids a few weeks ago, and my niece is definitely some kind of a extroverted intuitive. I think she might be, she's either INTP or a ENTP, and she's like in 3rd or 4th grade. But it was funny because she said her teachers thought she was all like upset or like in a bad mood or something, and she's like, no, I'm just thinking about dragons.
That's cute.
Yeah. So it's that is kind of the thing with extroverted intuitives is the mind will wander and into those areas. And I wanted to there's an important quote you might know it from what do you call this, from YouTube. It's from Jean Piaget, who I'm sure you know. He says a real problem is what, and then it's like a question, what is the real goal of education? Are we forming children who are only capable of learning what is already known? Or should we try to develop creative minds, creative and intuitive minds, capable of discovering from the preschool on throughout life? So,
Right, so that's a big debate in education about whether or not you can teach gifted skills. And personally, I don't know that we can, and that we even should try to do such a thing. I think that encouraging children to be their natural selves is probably the best way to be. I mean, education philosophies, they come and go and they go through waves. And right now it's really big on social emotional learning, and it's also really big into grit and creative thinking. Those are the 3 big things that are in education right now. And personally, like, I think that's incredible. It's very biased.
Right.
And it
yeah, some
is
will
not,
do really
and by
well
the
with
time
that,
it
and some
filters
won't.
down through all the bureaucracy, like you mentioned,
Yeah, because with all that, there's some
and grit looks different for every person.
So what do you think is the answer then on the sort of institutional level, as far as how that we somehow, especially because you don't really even want to type kids, so how do we in the education system potentially work through this to where we can bring out the intuitive, or bring out the thinking, or the sensing, or the feeling, or whatever the case is? What's your big idea?
One of the best things that I think teachers can do is they need to know their own type, because they need to know their own projection.
Right.
Like
People hate
that you were
that.
saying earlier about the kids being able to see that, like, it may not be the teacher. Our focus is actually more so on the adult
Right.
themselves, and focusing on the projection that could occur.
So this paper, by the way, and this big project you're working on, is that something that you're trying to put out to the teachers then, so that the teachers will be like, oh, there's a better way to teach? Is that kind of your goal then?
My goal is to get this out to as many people as who wants it. I just want people to read it and to think about it, and to take into consideration all of this work that I've done, because I've been a teacher this is my 8th year teaching. I have a master's degree in education. And I work in a Title I school. I work in one of the roughest and biggest high schools in Georgia. So I have a big passion for the education system, but I think it's terribly broken. And a lot of the teachers that I work with are introverted sensing dominance. And so I see firsthand what that does to children. I see it all the time. And we already have so many barriers with class and race and gender barriers, with most teachers being, middle class white women. And there's a lot of barriers between what they're able to do with children. And so I think, especially with social emotional learning, them understanding that they have this tendency to kind of project negativity onto their students just by their patterns of thinking, can be really helpful. And that can be a change that they do now, like just understanding that the child, particularly extroverted intuitive, so the INTP, ENTP, they can know that they're not being defiant, they're not being rude, they think differently.
Right.
And to value that thinking process.
And also to help them grow. So that was one thing that we talked about in the video as well, that it's not just setting them aside saying, like, you think differently, so you just sit over here and handle this yourself and the gifted program. But it's more so about actually learning how, so yes, focusing on yourself as a teacher and making sure that you're not projecting onto your students, but then taking those students and then helping them actually mature and grow within their own functions, their own types.
So basically what this is now, I really like what you did with the blog and all your media and everything, because I think it's kind of like what I hope to get at, kind of big picture. But so I'm looking at this, what's it called? The INTP data results. And so how is it that so is this basically each one is going to have its own, this is basically like a research paper on each type, and then this is the results for people to look over and to deal with however that they want to use these tools?
And then at the end, there will be so if you look, the last page on it is the semantics comparison. So there's a big giant chart of all of the comparison of what types of semantics were used to argue and to explain themselves. So what I plan to do is to take all 16 types and to look at all of these charts that compare the semantics and then talk about it all together. So there will be one final comparison piece.
So are you talking about the self-examination where you've got the word clouds and everything?
No, this is like the very last one. It says INTPs in education, and then it's like semantics comparison.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because one of the things that I've studied and looked at, and I do not have any degrees in this or anything like that, but I've spent a lot of times reading about neurolinguistics. I've got the studies that I looked at linked. But neurolinguistics is like it's tracking how your brain works through what types of words that you're using. And if you're focusing on concrete versus abstract languages and what that means for your brain and how your brain is wired. And so if theoretically, if somebody wanted to go about proving type, they would have to be a lot more educated than I am, obviously, but they could make that comparison of how are they speaking and connect it to how is their brain functioning.
Yeah, it's tricky too, because everyone is one person internally and then a different person externally, and then still even like a different person sort of in the shadow. And so especially with an introverted type, the main person that they are is more internal compared to an extroverted type. Perhaps it's easier to tell kind of what they are because they're used to connecting with the world in that way. Although the extroverted type might be a little tricky in a different way, only because for them to really think, so to speak, they're bouncing the ideas off another person. So them just putting out the answers is only like half the thing. It takes like sometimes a couple steps for the extrovert to process it out on another person and then reflect it back, and then sometimes that takes 2 or 3 times for so I don't know, it's just tricky stuff to get this data right, but I think you figured out how to do it. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of time.
Yes, it does.
So what are some ways that we can figure out how to use this in our personal relationships? Like, is that something that you're kind of trying to get into with the study and with your channel and everything, or is it really focused on the education system?
The education system was the first project.
Mm-hmm.
The next project, which will begin who knows when,
Mm-hmm.
sometime in 2021.
Hopefully, as soon as I'm finished with this, because it takes a long time to do all these things, and COVID has made like real life really challenging.
Right.
So I don't have as much time as I want to get all this out as quickly as I want to. But the next data set will focus on relationships. So I'm interested in how people define certain things and how people see certain things and what people look at when they're looking for a relationship. But it's because the number one question that we get asked at Typecast Hero, aside from what should I do with my life, is who is my perfect type?
Who should I be with?
So we want to, like, that's the next one that's going to be examined.
So this has been, so basically you're spending about a year on education focus. Now, what's it going to be like on this next one that's more focused on relationships? Is that going to be like a whole other set of questions and a whole another year? That's so you're going to like do this every year, like a new focus? And
at this point we have at least, aside from even just like the questions and the interviews and different data, we have at least, I would say, 2 years worth of just ideas for like what we want to discuss. 2 to 3 years. So, but then if you take into consideration that each data set will take approximately 12 months, that's just based off of
how long
this education one, right? So who knows what the relationship one might be different, but just based off of this, and PCH is just getting started, really.
Yeah, because like you said, they asked about relationships, and I was just kind of thinking about like personal family relationships, not even necessarily romantic relationships, because I think that's a whole other ball of wax. Because because the thing with relationships in general, it's more than anything, it's a matter of not giving up on them, whatever the relationship is, especially nowadays. Just like I said, the trend, like that's how we were for like millions of years. That if we, everybody's in their little villages or their small towns. So it's like, if you have a fight with your family or with your husband or wife or anybody that you're around, the only option is to work it out. That's how it was for like a million years. But now in the modern world, protecting our egos and projecting everywhere and shadow stuff and everything else, it's like, oh, this relationship's uncomfortable, I'm never talking to that person again, or I'm quitting school, or I'm quitting this job. So a lot of I know that's probably an oversimplification, but a lot of the thing with relationships is just not to give up on them, because that's kind of the tendency now. But I don't know, is there sort of a general thing that you would tell people how to do better with relationships and take personality into account?
It's about you. It's about learning yourself and learning this is my opinion. We may have two different opinions here, but for me, it's about looking at yourself and making sure that you have your foundation and your value set, and that you're constantly striving to be the best version of you.
Right.
And you can't control what anyone else around you is doing or thinking or saying. And so you can only control your own reactions and your own emotions about those things. All that being said, that also, like, you can see my functions coming out in this answer.
No, I like it.
Yeah, I've got introverted feeling, and that is my compulsion. That's my parent function, and that's what this is all about. So for me, it is about making sure that I'm the best version of me, and that at the end of the day, I can look in the mirror and feel good about myself, and then that I'm treating others well as well. With that, though, I think that what MBTI can do is, and it's what we say on our channel all the time, is that it's giving you a language outside of the norm on how to understand yourself more and how to understand others more. And so, for example, when Jesse and I are, if we're having an argument about something, or if we're kind of off, or even people in our significant others or anything, we can approach it with the terminology that we've gathered from MBTI, and we can actually say like, hey, this is how I'm projecting onto you right now, or I understand this is how you're feeling, but this is why I'm feeling this way is because of these functions that I'm using. And it's just a completely different language, I think, and it's so in depth and so personal that I think it's once you get on the same language, it's so much easier to handle whatever you're going through in that relationship, personal, romantic, or otherwise.
Yeah, it helps to take things apart, because one thing that happens in any relationship, whether it's a student teacher or family relationship, romantic relationship, is where it gets worse and worse and worse, and where we can get sucked into the whole like, no, it's not you, it's me. No, it's not me, it's you, and all that. Where if you can use almost any tool to say it's this other thing, which can just be personality and how personalities interact. Like we mentioned last time, love languages, which is somewhat of a useful tool, but it's kind of that same thing where it's like, really, I think more than anything, those kind of things, it's just like a tool to say, to detach the whole like, it's not me, it's you, it's not you, it's me, kind of like pointing fingers at each other, and just like have another thing that's between you to focus on, like, let's approach this a different way. So I don't know, what do you think, Jesse, as far as this with relationships?
No, I agree with Amanda, and I think Carl Jung talked about how you should actually not run away from conflict, because if you have a problem with someone, if someone's getting on your nerves or you think they're the problem, there's actually a great opportunity to look at yourself.
Right.
Why is that bothering you?
Yeah, so you should be looking at yourself and looking at your shadow and looking at your top functions.
Well,
and I think that can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Well, and the other aspect to that too is, not just to run away from it or not, like we talked about and Carl Jung talked about, but the other aspect to that too is whether you like end the relationship or not. Sometimes we'll stay in a relationship, or even if it's like a family relationship or school, work, whatever, and then but we act like it doesn't bother us when it does. And then what that'll do is it'll cause a repression and even complexes and neurosis potentially, or at least between that relationship. And it doesn't go away forever. It comes out one way or another somehow. So yeah, a lot of this, I think, is just helping people figure out new ways to approach conflict more than anything.
It's true. And also I think it's important to understand that self-sufficiency is a big thing that I think too many people do not focus on. A lot of people like to blame their unhappiness on external circumstance.
Right.
And barring situations of, obviously extreme poverty or abuse, or there's a lot of external circumstances that can severely affect your mental health. But in the Western world, for the most part, a lot of people are free from those kind of things. And they want to blame their unhappiness on everything else, but they don't look inward. And one of the things that Carl Jung wrote a lot about was cheating. So he was in a really healthy marriage for a really long time. And he talks about how when people are cheating or looking outside of their marriage, it's their animus, their fourth function really coming out, and they're wanting to find a way to like meet that need when they really just need to look internally. He wrote about it consistently.
Yeah, that's another thing I thought we might get into is all this is interesting, but it gets into these universal archetypes that I talk about a lot here. And the thing about these universal archetypes, including the anima animus, is, and like I just did a podcast on that subject just a few days ago, where and now I'm actually I put up the YouTube version, but I have to put up the podcast version, and it's tricky because there's like so much more that could be said. Like we talked for almost an hour and a half, and there's like so much more that can be said because so much has to do with like animus projection. Yeah, it goes into your personal relationships with the opposite sex, but then it'll also go into to a different way with your peers, and a different way with your you project things onto your parents or the authority roles. But then this just gets into projection in general. Like I said earlier, when you're talking about projections, it's like people hate to acknowledge projection, because then it just like acknowledges the snake that's coming out of them and that it's their fault. But and people get addicted to it too, to the projection. It's like a drug, because it protects their ego.
It does, but I also think it's just I think people are unsettled by the idea that they may not see reality clearly.
Right.
And projection, Carl Jung talked about the reason why projection is so dangerous is precisely that.
Right.
Because you can't see reality when you're projecting. You can't see a person for who they are. You can't value them for what they should be valued for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you make that suggestion to a person, particularly if they're really holding on to that projection,
Mm-hmm.
They get really defensive. That how dare you say I can't see what you see, or how dare you question my version of reality.
Right.
And I mean, when it comes to reality, I'm probably the strongest with subjective tendencies. Like, I believe that everybody sees a different version of reality, and that's fine. I think you should try to understand the other person's. I don't necessarily believe in objective reality. That's actually one of the things we're supposed to be talking about on a different podcast. But I think when you make that suggestion to someone that their version of true is not necessarily all of truth, they don't like it. They get really stuck. People are really
it's very similar to we've seen this a lot the last couple hundred years, where people have their religious ideals falling apart and becoming more challenged. And that's a whole other debate in itself, as far as religion and the utility of it and everything else. But it's very similar, because it's not just like if sometimes people get very religious about other things, like a TV show or a sports team or something, but they can take it when you're like, oh, your team's stupid usually. But the thing is with religious ideals is that crushes their reality potentially. And so that's why people get really touchy. Same thing with if you get them to realize they're projecting, they're being passive aggressive when they don't think that they are, then it crushes their reality. And that's like their whole world. I mean, like, you having a proper version of reality is probably the most valuable thing that there is. It's like more valuable than any amount of money, because you can have any amount of money in the world, but if you have a totally distorted view of reality, that money's not going to help you. So and the thing is too, it's pretty unconscious rather than conscious. But I don't know. So since you're on another podcast, maybe you could tell us, at least briefly, Jesse, this idea of objective versus subjective reality.
It's a personal thing.
No. You don't need to get too personal. Well, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm saying that, like, I don't ever pretend to be the authority on anything. I'm just saying, like, with all of I was a philosophy major in college.
Okay.
That was my first degree, and then my other degree, I have two. So like my undergrad degrees were religion, one in philosophy, and then I have a master's degree in education. I mean, I'm pretty relative. I'm just a big relativist. So when it comes to objective reality, I don't necessarily personally believe that there is one that we can reach, that humans can reach. But I do think that we should be trying to reach it as best we can.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons that Carl Jung, who's really more of a philosophy thing than a psychology thing, and I understand that that's really
debatable.
Yes, controversial at best. But personally, I think that he's way more into the philosophy side of existence. And so when I look at him, and he's wanting people to tear apart these projections, and he's wanting them to kind of to understand themselves in like these cages, because a projection really is a cage, and and everybody has them
bad or good, but it's
a great way to like look at yourself and take an opportunity for introspection. But I did want to point out, you're talking about people's relationships with their religion. Something that I think is really interesting is that INTPs, so one of the questions that I asked was, how would you be convinced to go against your moral code? For INTPs, 76% of them did not reference a personal moral code at all. So like they didn't mention religion. They didn't mention like a specific type of philosophy or a mindset or anything like that that they ascribe to.
Interesting.
It's super fascinating because ENFPs, whose data is like ready to go, it was over half of them did talk about this. They had a set. They could tell you right away. So even on a big societal scale, we can look at this. We can look at why certain individuals have trouble letting go of religion or letting their religion be questioned. It really, that can be explained with type as well.
Yeah, well, and it's strange to me too, because as I've gotten to know myself better, at least in the typing sense, I looked back and I thought I was more sort of prone to be religious because of being INTP. But I guess that's sort of wrong. But of course, there's going to be religious people with every type, and every type will have some varying forms of religion. Although the sort of next level to that question that's kind of tricky is whether it's because the individual versus like collective truth, and you kind of like talked a little bit about this in your INTP video, but with at least with that question, it's like, is it my moral code or is it like the moral code? Where I think it can get confusing, because it's like my moral code might be one thing, but am I going to reference a religious moral code or a government moral code or whatever that might be? So I don't know, that's a really tricky one. But a lot of this too, I think gets into that sort of like philosophical thing of like what the individual is. Sometimes people will say like the individual is an illusion, but I'd say it's like a useful illusion, almost like it may or may not be, but it's almost like free will. There may or may not be free will, but if there is not, it's an illusion to look like there is, and it's a useful illusion to look like there is. So tricky stuff, especially when you're trying to get people to think on the individual level, especially INTPs like us.
Well, for INTPs, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that they don't reference themselves often. So this was said in the video and in the data. So they present something, they'll present an idea, but they don't say like I think or I feel or I believe. They just say this is. So they would say like when they're looking at that morality question and they like to tear it apart and they say, well, morality can mean lots of different things, just like you said, and then they would go off with that explanation. But they didn't really answer my question, and they didn't refer to themselves at all.
The question specifically says to you.
Yeah, so it's not, and they're not doing that, and other types will. So I say in the paper, like, this is not to imply that INTPs don't have values or can't.
Right.
But when you compare like the amount of time, like that was something else. I'm not sure if you looked at that part in the chart, but like I looked at how long their answers were. And so like the morality question was on one of the lower ends. They didn't spend a lot of time like answering. Yes.
That's weird, because as you can see, I could go on about that for hours.
But yes, so the answers that they were really, so just for comparison, the average word length for the moral code was 63. So 63 words. But then if you look at the big abstract concept of like describe the inside of your mind, which is my favorite question, that was 91 words. And then when I asked them about formal education, that was roughly 77 words. So the morality question was not as given as much time in comparison to other things. So it's not to say that they can't talk about this, they haven't thought about it. It's just that there are other things they'd rather discuss or look at.
Yeah, it's strange too, because I don't know. We mentioned this, I think, last time, how that like I don't know if I want to say like I'm more integrated than I used to, but probably a few years ago or at some point in my 20s ish, if you ask me the same question, I might just be like, oh, just because, you know, or something in fewer words. Whereas now that I've like really tried to dive deep and kind of like understand these things that I kind of like took for granted in the past, maybe now it's like, we can look at this at 100 different angles and understand it in a lot of different ways. And yeah, a lot of actually one person who came to mind when you were saying that in the video is that's one, I think, valid criticism of Jordan Peterson. And it's sort of hard to put into words, but it's that he doesn't attach himself to his ideas enough. Like even in his really long book, it's kind of like here's this pile of ideas. Like, he probably does a little bit more in 12 Rules for Life, but in his super long book, it's just kind of like here's all the ideas from history, and then when he like presents the ideas of neo postmodernism and neo-Marxism, it's not ever like, hey, I have this idea and whatever. It's like, here's all these philosophers and here's all this stuff. So he works to detach himself from his ideas, and that's not necessarily all bad, because I think what is, and this is just kind of like in general looking at people with that kind of behavior, but what I think sometimes what people do when they're doing that, especially someone who's in working at a university and those kind of things, they're trying to be more empirical with it than just like, this is my opinion. But sometimes, like the way that he has recurated certain ideas, even Piaget, who we mentioned, even Carl Jung, who we talk about, it's better if he can say, this is how that I've curated these ideas to be mine specifically, because that's where he gets, that's where he gets in trouble a lot. Yeah.
He's done a lot of, I appreciate what he's done, just like I appreciate a lot of people who have done a lot for the MBTI community, because I think that it's overall positive. But when I've looked at his work, I've looked at his books, I'm not a huge fan of Jordan Peterson. Because of this, he is very arrogant with his belief systems, and he's very much like, this is what it is. And it's very off-putting, and it's a little frustrating because a lot of people lack the critical thinking skills to really determine what's accurate and what isn't. And so and I always feel like I feel like if he wanted to be responsible with the information that he's putting out, that he would clarify. But I also understand that there are certain thought patterns that kind of tend towards exactly what we're talking about,
an opinion, and they don't say it as if it were an opinion. They just say it as if it were fact, and that's not.
They may not even know that they're doing it. And with him, particularly with how he's used MBTI, I don't know that he's necessarily even aware that he's doing this thing.
Yeah, he's very.
It may not have ever occurred to him.
He's actually very against MBTI, and he's like, "That's trash. It's all about Big Five model," and which goes into what you were just saying, as how that, like, it would be better if he said, "I have this opinion or experience from my whatever, my research, that Big Five has this advantage, and maybe not MBTI in like the corporate setting, which is mainly where he's been trying to use the Big Five." But yeah. But I don't know. It kind of seems like an INTP thing or something related to it. Although he is his own special ball of wax, but which brings challenges, like you mentioned. But also, even the challenges, I think, are overall a benefit. And I'm not trying to like bring up a Jordan Peterson debate or anything. It's just that it's an interesting thing where that, like, he has done a lot of things that are controversial, but because there's been nobody else like that. Everybody else, too much so, is too careful with what that they say. So you can hardly even criticize them because they're just so like ultra careful with what they say, if they say anything in the public sphere. And so him doing so in this sort of what's the word? I don't know, trailblazer kind of way, off the cuff kind of way sometimes. And with the material that he does with Jung and Nietzsche and everything else, it makes people have to dig in and figure things out. So yeah, there's definitely pros and cons, but that might be another whole podcast to get into. In fact, I'm doing one like that in a couple of days. But I know one of the controversial things with MBTI, even other, like, okay, I just mentioned that person and how he has his quarrels with it, but
he does, but he's also pushed like positive things with MBTI. Like Jordan Peterson is around a lot with MBTI and like advocating for it to be used in different settings. So it seems like he's got,
he's a little flip-floppy. Yeah. Well,
Big Five came into the game like what year was that? That has not been around too long. It's been like since the 90s. And so like Big Five is not, it's like a and they don't have to be necessarily like counter exclusive or DISC if people use that instead. Like there's lots of different assessments that people have used. But MBTI, as it's used for corporate headhunting or for career development, I don't agree with that at all. So if that's something that
well,
I don't think it should be used for that.
Because that is the tricky thing, because that's how he was kind of approaching it. Was he tells the story that he when he was working at Harvard as a junior professor or whatever, they were barely making money, or just kind of enough to get by, because that's just how it is at Harvard as a junior professor. And so they advised him to do some other kind of consulting or something to make ends meet, so to speak, especially because it's very expensive in that Boston area. So what he did is he found at that time that he wanted to find something to apply to the corporate environment, because he thought that could potentially be financially lucrative or whatever. And he found at that time that MBTI wasn't working, but that's when he really discovered the Big Five. And so he was kind of looking at it from that perspective of corporate headhunting kind of thing, and all that kind of stuff. But what I was, I guess, more interested in is they're not just him, but more so like generally the orthodox Jungians, a lot of them are somewhat against MBTI, mainly because Carl Jung, he didn't do the J versus P. He basically just did them completely separate. Although the thing I think of the way that Carl Jung did it, it makes less sense the way that we think of it as a 4-letter code to include the J versus P and everything, but it makes more sense the way that you now do it with the stack of 8, because he was all about, you have the 4 functions, and then we have our what do you call the attitude of introverted versus extroverted. So I don't know, what do you say to those who are maybe the orthodox Jungians, or some who are against MBTI as Jungian or as a general tool?
So I don't use it the way that MBTI was originally created. So I draw a lot on John Beebe's work.
Who's a Jungian?
He is, but he's also the one who came up with the 8-letter code.
Right. Which, like I said, that makes more sense than the 4-letter code, especially from a Jungian perspective.
And I am not looking at it as so Isabel Myers in Gifts Differing, she talks about this, like she wanted this to be used so that people could try to figure out careers and figure out life plans. And I don't use it for that. What I'm looking at with MBTI, and really the only thing that I use MBTI for, is to figure out which functions are being used in what order, so that you can work from there and go forward, so that you can start to look at the archetypes and how they'll present, like your second code or your second function being more of like that parent figure in your life, or your child function, or your inferior function. It's a way more in-depth look at typology. So for me, it's just an extra, more detailed version of what Carl Jung does, of what Jungian analysts do. It's just giving you more ways to express it. It's allowing you to really get into that archetypal discussion of how these things are playing out in your shadow. And then in addition to that, I think there's also other analysts who talk, they all do, they talk about function use. So they talk about being introverted feelers, they talk about being extroverted feelers, they talk about these differences. And I think it gives people a language to discuss all of this.
It almost simplifies it and allows it to end up, like we talked about in the last one we were all discussing, was about those love languages and how we want this terminology and this language to be used like in the mainstream essentially to bring people together, and to give that understanding and that grace, and this kind of lets that happen.
Yeah, the one thing that I learned. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, John Beebe does a lot of work with this, but also Mark Hunsaker, who is not a Jungian analyst, but he has done a lot with depth typology.
Right.
So he's somebody else who deals a lot with using all 8 functions and where they're going to play out. And then I would argue even Marie-Louise von Franz, who studied under Jung, her book, Lectures on Typology, you couldn't, MBTI gives you a place to understand where those functions come into play. So like for me, I'm not using MBTI so that I can like box everybody up. I'm using it so that I can understand how their functions work. So I would argue that I'm not even really I'm not a hard and fast MBTI follower.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say one thing that I feel like I learned recently as I've been trying to better understand this. I sent you or linked you or tagged you or whatever in the typing I had done by the blind ENFJ typologist, Rachel Rebecca, which was, and the reason I mentioned that is because the process that I think she does is probably largely similar to what you do, where she gets it into the stack of 8. But unfortunately, that's just really what it takes. Is these kind of things that where it's like just answer 100 questions online, or just kind of go off of assumptions, or go off of like you like people, so you must be an extrovert, and all this stuff that causes more confusion than it solves. So I think, I don't know, what might really need to happen is everybody realize they don't know anything until they really get typed, which I don't know if that can be done through anything online, whether that is just going to take more questions, or if really it has to be done through some kind of an interview format, like you guys do and Rachel Rebecca does. Because that's the only place where it starts to really make sense, is when you can really confidently have that 8-letter stack figured out. So I don't know what you think.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because I know that you had your type. Well, you had your type journey, and Amanda actually had want to talk about hers a little bit. She had trouble with her type as well. So I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that at all.
Yeah, so a lot of people ask us about those tests as well, and I think that's why this is so difficult and why we don't tend to necessarily agree with MBTI in totality, because like using it as a career aptitude thing, whenever you go to take that test, you're relying on people, first of all, being self-aware enough and having known themselves enough to be able to read these questions and give the right answer. And typically what you'll find is that people are answering what they think they are, what they wish they could be, rather than what they actually truly are in that moment.
Right.
But then also just the way that the questions are interpreted as well. And then also just because you can be looping, because you can be using your first and second, because you could be using your second and fourth, whatever it could be, those are all going to skew all those test results. Right. So so for myself, but to this day, I just actually last week took another test, and I hadn't taken a test in probably I don't know, 6 months, 5 or 6 months. Because I finally did settle on ENFP. But before, I would always test as an ENTJ, and I still test as an ENTJ, even last week when I took a test. And that's very much not correct at all whatsoever. But even now, even with what I know and trying to be as unbiased as I possibly can be while taking the test, it still comes up as ENTJ. And I can explain why that is now. But before, what ended up happening was I got that test result, I read the results, and then I wrote off MBTI completely because I didn't agree with the results and I couldn't see myself as an ENTJ. And so I was like, the MBTI is bunk. I don't want to mess with this. I don't agree with this. I don't even believe in this. It has no utility. And it wasn't until I was able to actually start studying the functions that I realized the difference.
So I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is like, how do we think that we can solve that? Because I see that as like a recurring problem in stories like that, and my own, and others, especially when people are trying to, type their children and everything, where it's hard and it's a process. And I don't know if we just have to like ultimately get an interview type process with someone, or maybe if you can't like interview with a typologist or whatever, then maybe it's just, if you can't, then it's just going to be that you have to take the test with another person, like someone close to you.
That's something that I've suggested in the past. So like when I type someone, I have 3 tests that I look at as a base. And I actually use them a lot differently than people expect me to, because when I send out the process and I tell them what to do with the test, and they're like, oh, she's making me take these tests. And the tests are bad and all this stuff. But I'm looking at specific things. So like, for instance, when I make them take one of the IDR tests, because I really like our IDR labs and their testing assessment systems, but when they get that 4-letter code and it tells me what percentage of introversion they are, I can use that, and I can use it to understand, like, is this person looping between their first and third? So like, for instance, if somebody's 100% introverted, I might have a good idea that they could be looping between that first and third function. Right. And so I understand that could skew their results. They may look like a feeler type when they're actually a thinker type. And the test doesn't account for that, but I know that because I've done this for forever now. And then I also look at, and the function tests can do the same thing. So like, I make them take tests that specifically measure functions. But we talked about this on the last podcast. No test that I'm aware of types along the axis, which makes no sense. I don't understand why they don't exist.
Is that what you do in your interview though? When you do the interview with people? Okay. See, that's what I'm wondering, is if it's going to take that to really get a strong result that people can be confident in. Because I think the tricky thing too is, you like, when you take those tests that are like 100 or so questions, they're just trying to get that general idea of the 4-letter code, but to really have it confidently, you've got to go look at all 8 and figure out for sure like all 8 to like really solve the puzzle. Otherwise, if you just try to sort of like get the 4-letter code on top, it's not really all there until you solve for all 8.
Well, it's interesting to me because I feel like when you take the Enneagram test, which has blown up over the past few years, right? You get, potentially you can get 4 or 5 different results, and then it's just kind of well known in that community that once you get those results, then it's up to you to kind of make the decision on what type you are, like what number you are, right? And so it's not necessarily a one and done. I'm going to take this test and get this result, and then this is like end all be all what I am. It is supposed to actually be a push so you can start researching it yourself and figure out yourself. And then at the end of the day, you make that decision. And for some reason, MBTI has not been pushed that way. It's just like, oh, here are my 4 letters, and this is it. And this is what I am, and this is what I'm going to call myself forever.
And I compare to these celebrities.
Yeah, exactly.
That's about it.
I'm like, no,
yeah. I'm like Steve Jobs. That's cool.
Right. I like this side because I'm like him. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so Jesse and I talked about in the very, very beginning how cool it would be if we were able to eventually figure out how to create a test like this. That discussion has not actually happened, but we're on the same page. Like, is there a way to simplify this and put something out there without having to necessarily go through those conversations and find somebody who can walk you through it. But as of right now, there's not like a 100% certain.
Yeah, because
and when you do, so I just said that like I'm not super into like I'm not a super MBTI purist. However, when I type someone in my disclaimer, I have that the only person who can really determine your type is you. And I feel like in MBTI, there's a lot of people who want that validation. They want to be told like they're choosing the right one. It takes a lot of introspection, and that's a scary place, I think, for a lot of people to be. A lot
they
of
don't
people
want
don't want to do that journey alone, which is how Jungian analysts think. Yeah, that's what Jungian analysts even like began as, is like people who wanted to dive into these recesses.
Yeah, a lot of people try to avoid
figure out their dreams, figure out why they're having these impulses or these. Right, and you can't. So like in our archetype videos, we deal with we did the three feminine archetypes, and then we did three masculine archetypes, and we dealt with it with people who did the opposite function. So like how female thinkers, male feelers, right? How they would deal with those archetypes, and we talked about how like I heard this one Jungian analyst give this great metaphor, but it's like a hand reaching out from the grave. Like it's going to come out from the dirt and it's going to grab your ankle, and you can't like these urges, these impulses are going to come out and get you, and like there's nothing you can do about it except for acknowledge when it happens. And people don't want to. Well, and then you look at society as well and what we're all being pushed into, and what is like the busier you are and the more stressed out you are, the more successful you are in some way or fashion. Like like that chaos is something that we've almost been trained to crave a little bit. Yeah. And so when you think of it like that as well, then it's going to take then, and you can actually see that in the rise of certain types over the years, like the different percentages that have changed over the years. You can definitely see how people are almost being pushed out of that introspection.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's it is part of the culture for sure, because now, like I was saying earlier, more than ever in the culture, people feel like they can just run away from things, but that just causes repressions and suppressions, and that doesn't really go away. It just kind of goes in the unconscious and comes out later. And so I don't know, I guess what might possibly help people the most is just to kind of see how the functions work, how they work playing off of other people. And then I mean, it's a bigger thing when you get into the archetypes and everything, because not everybody wants to do it, but if they do, that's where potentially the answers are. Because ultimately what you're figuring out, if you can solve that puzzle, what you then see is that abnormalities, which is the personal complexes. And then those are what gets projected out in unhealthy ways. And those are what need to be solved for, because it's normal to have a shadow. It's just a matter of integrating it in a healthy way. It's normal to have animus projection. It's just figuring out how to do so in a productive way rather than just completely unconscious. And I think what people really get frustrated with, probably more than anything, is this idea of control. Just like how that we try to like seek happiness and avoid pain and everything. And that's good, but a lot of it too, like the ups and downs of happiness and pain are inevitable. So more than anything, it's people clamoring for control. Same thing with this stuff is people are trying to have control. Yeah. Were you saying something?
I was just going to say, I think there's an awful lot of shame also when people have when they have impulses and urges that they don't really know what to deal with. I see this a lot with people who are, I see a lot of this with introverted intuitives who are young. And I mean introverted intuitives, that's anybody who has an IN. So IN types who are very young, and they like, I want something more, I want something bigger, but they have like these abstract ideas of what that looks like, and they don't have anything concrete. So like they can't say like, I want to go be a doctor, because their dreams don't look like that. And
Right.
I think there's a lot of shame for them when they've got these impulses or desires, because they don't know how to make those dreams reality. And then on the flip side, with extroverts, particularly as they get older, I see a lot of them who have, for the first time, they've always done things. They've always done the concrete. They've always done actions.
Right.
And now they're looking at who they are, and they may be looking at their marriage for the first time and be like, this is not it. Or their
Right.
career, and they're like, this doesn't mean anything to me. And so there's shame with that too, that they've spent like their whole lives creating these things and doing these things, and now all of a sudden they realize, or they feel like it doesn't mean anything to them. And one of the things that I urge people to do is to realize that these feelings are normal, and just because you feel a thing or want a thing or imagine a thing does not mean you have to go and get it. That's something I tell people over and over and over again, because they seem to think that, like, if I feel this way about my marriage, if I feel this way about my career, that means that I've got to bail out now. I've got to go off and
Right.
do this thing. And they don't have to. They
Yeah.
need to introspect inward. It doesn't mean action needs to be taken.
Well, when you say shame, that reminds me of something I read recently in this book I'm studying on the podcast, Jung's Map of the Soul, where the author Murray Stein was talking about in Western culture traditionally, although it's a little bit different the more modern we've been getting and more integrated with the whole world, our culture was a guilt culture, which meant that, like, if someone does something wrong or seems taboo or whatever, then they have guilt and they can be redeemed from that guilt. But the sort of Eastern way is a shame culture, which means basically, like, if you do something shameful, it's kind of the end of the world and you've shamed your family and all that stuff. Where now I feel like as we've gotten it more modern, we've become more of a shame culture, which, I mean, we even see it in, like, we don't need to get into the whole like leftist or whatever debate, but like even in like how that now it's like, oh, you like did something bad 10 years ago on Twitter, you're canceled and we're going to ruin your career. That's very shame over guilt and hopefully find redemption. So yeah, we need to be more understanding of ourselves and each other, which is more and it's the tricky thing is when we say something like that, people can often misinterpret it as like, oh, there's no morality or morality is subjective. And it's not that, but it's that we need to have when something wrong is done, we need to first of all figure out if it really was wrong or if it's just a feeling that it's wrong. And then we need to figure out how to potentially have redemption for the person. So and understanding personality helps.
Understanding persona is important too.
What's that? What's important?
Understanding persona. And so, like, understanding that, like you were just talking about, like people who say things with Twitter and 10 years ago, I think people need to understand that everyone has a persona, and Carl Jung deals with persona a lot. But like understanding that difference between the face people show the world and who they are and who they actually are. People need to know that about themselves, and they need to know that about others. And I think it's like a really basic concept.
Yeah, and the personas linked directly with the shadow is the other thing that we learned recently here as going through that book, is that whatever people put forth in their, overt, this is my civilized persona, the opposite is then repressed and will come out eventually in the shadow.
Which is funny because that's related to function.
Yeah.
So like if people are projecting a function out, the other one is going to be repressed. That's how it works.
Right.
So that's when you can see, like, if you are an extroverted thinking dominant, for instance, and like needs to be done through this crowdsourced efficient way, that means you're repressing your introverted thinking process. And so like you may demonize that in others. And you may like demonize it in yourself, like, oh, my own thoughts, if it goes away from the crowd, is not worthy.
And then you project that on others. Right. So you project out the ideal, this is my perfect persona. And it's weird too, because sometimes people will even rewrite history that way. Like I've had arguments with people sometimes where they we all do this sometimes, some more than others, but they'll remember a an encounter completely different than reality, because that's what their civilized persona needs. But and a lot of times too, what it'll do is it was covering up the way that maybe a shadow acted out when they were had a conflict or something. So and what that also gets into, and this is why it all gets into all the sort of like Jungian archetypes and everything, is it's also that the complexes have their like their own autonomous consciousness that protect themselves. So they're it's all tricky stuff, because it's like they are unconsciously moving their own way, and that's why I think we get so overtly sort of like we need control, because we barely have any.
Right, and making the unconscious conscious is
Right.
a lot of work, and it takes a lot of self-look and a lot of looking at a lot of negative things about yourself. And I see so many people just refuse to look at the negative.
Right,
I mean, and I because I don't believe in like one version of reality necessarily, it's tricky sometimes for people to come around to see their own actions in their own version, and they want to say this is the reality because that's what they're with. And I think it's a really sad state of existence to be really confined to your own reality box.
Well,
but you were talking about, I immediately started thinking about when you were the people who rewrite history. I was thinking about also introverted sensing in the shadow.
Right.
That can do the same thing, because introverted sensing is your own perception of an experience, devoid of the bigger picture. It's like your own personal view of that. And if it's in a lower stack, or if it's in the shadow, the lower half, it can come out in really negative ways as well.
I laugh because it's my fourth function and her eighth function.
Yeah, it's my demon.
It's your demon. Yeah, I've dealt with some introverted sensing demons, but that's okay. We love them anyway. We love those little demons. So
sorry, it froze for a second. It's my demon function.
Yeah, your demon froze the computer for a minute, or the internet. That little demon. So one thing I wanted to cover, and we're just about done, but I meant to get into it sooner, but it's just the confusing thing. I think we talked about it a little bit last time, but the confusing thing as to what introversion is versus extroversion. So I don't know if you can try to clear that up for us, because people often think it's just about wanting to be around people or not, when it's really about if you're processing things on the inside versus off of other people. So how can you help us clarify what introversion versus extroversion is?
So we have a couple of videos that cover this on our channel. So like we have one that does I versus E that goes into depth. We have one that that's function comparison. So like introverted thinking versus extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling. However, it's where your focus is. And this is a bear to get people to admit. Sometimes I see this when I'm typing, particularly extroverted perceivers, because their focus is out. So it's like when they are out, they are taking in information first. That's what they're doing. So they don't come into a room and try to project themselves onto whatever they're experiencing. They're taking in the experience.
Right.
And often, particularly for the EP type, the extroverted perceivers, they don't really want to talk to people because that's sensory overload. They just want to take in information. And so they feel like, since they're sitting, they're not talking, they're not interacting, they're just observing, they feel like they're very introverted because of that colloquial understanding of what introversion is.
Right.
But they're not. They're taking in information. Versus an introvert, like an introverted feeler, they walk into a room and they are projecting their value system onto that space, and they're taking in information through a filter. So introverts are ones who filter in the information, and extroverts are the one who have a less defined filter.
Right.
All right, we're gonna have to watch your videos. That's deep stuff. But yeah, but I mean, it's so tricky because sometimes, like, okay, myself being INTP, I feel sometimes like I'm more extroverted only because of my extroverted intuition wants to go out and like superly intuit everything externally. But then really, I guess what I'm dealing with is the introverted thinking, which is actually accurate, that I want to. And actually, maybe that's the final question is how an INTP can be a better podcaster is because that's what that's what I'm having. That's what I think I have trouble with, is because before not being a podcaster, it's normal that I just like process everything on the inside. But now that I'm like, I usually do everything as an internal process, but now that I've got to do so externally, then like what you're seeing when I'm like on one of these mini rants or whatever, you're seeing what normally goes on in the inside, but I need to twist that so it gets in the form of a not so open-ended question. I guess is what I'm trying to get better at as a INTP podcaster.
I don't think so. I think you just own it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I can very clearly see your extroverted intuition.
Yeah, I say own
very
it.
clearly see your processing. And I mean, I would love it because I have an extroverted intuition hero. So I love talking to you about this stuff. But I really do. That's the whole thing, is just own who you are, own it, and the right people will find you and love it. And I think they have. You have such a great following. We were actually just talking about the growth that we've seen in your channel and your community since we started following you.
Since you're on last
time. Huge difference. So I think you're very successful.
I think so. You were talking about like wanting to do it all internally, but I think your thought process is valuable and like sharing it. And if it's a concern or something that you feel like you could improve on, I mean, sometimes just stating that you're thinking out loud. Like let me say before, like let me talk this out. Because people are used to that. Extroverts do this constantly. So just stating like let me go through this.
And that's something you're probably way more aware of than other people are. Like I think out loud all the time, and I don't ever give a disclaimer that I'm thinking out loud. I just talk. It can be off-putting to some people because they think that those are my final thoughts, and they're not. I promise.
I guess what I'm trying to get better at is take those and then close it in like a not so open-ended question. So then when I finish that out loud thought, the person has something to go with. But you're right. Well, okay.
I understand what you're doing. I get it. This is so. It's a great extrovert feeling inferior thing that you are worried about right now. Like your inferior function, because you're worried that the person that may, and it's also a TI thing. You're worried the person may not understand what you're trying to get at because you've been talking out loud, and then you end on an open-ended thing. But I think you're giving them freedom and it's also your extroverted intuition, because you don't really you're not asking a question with a goal in mind. Like me, I'm an introverted intuitive, right? So I'm going to ask something and I already know what I'm looking for, because that's how I function. Extroverted intuition is all about exploring
into the unknown.
Right. So having that open-ended discussion, that is have that freedom for that person to answer however they want to interpret that question.
Right.
And you are good though, I will say, when like for example, when we answered something that wasn't exactly what you were looking for, and you were able to tailor it again.
The intuition.
More detailed.
One thing that I realized, by the way, is when my sister sort of projected on me that I was an ENTP, and so I thought I had extrovert thinking, introverted intuition, or something like that. But one advice that they give people is to become better at using their sort of like secondary function. So when I kind of had that projected upon me, much love to my sister, no disrespect, but I was thinking like, oh, I'm overly intuitive. I need to use my thinking function more. But actually what I think was happening, as kind of like I talk about sometimes, like now I'm more integrated or whatever. It's that my maturation has been to become less overly thinking and to integrate the secondary function, which is the extrovert intuition more. So that's what helped me, but it took me up into just a couple weeks ago to figure that out.
Yeah, no, I feel like that was actually my personal journey as well. My type journey was looking at that second function, because it's just so easy to skip over because of the opposite attitude. That it is, it's so easy to skip over it. And that was truly how, like, if anyone ever does have an issue figuring out their type, that's always the number one advice. The first piece of advice anyways is to look at that second and just make sure you're not skipping over that and moving without even realizing it.
Right. All right. Well, this has been really good. Yeah, we might even do this again in a few weeks once you're all wrapped up with your project. And yeah, thanks for all of your advice and everything. What is any how do we find the website and everything? I got it through a link, but how do we find your website and all that stuff so people can get involved and maybe reach out if they are ES or anything?
So we have everything on Facebook and Instagram. We're also in Discord and YouTube. But our website and our blog website and our YouTube are all linked on Facebook. And then we just launched our podcast. So we're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Breaker, all those.
Look at you saving the world. Yeah. All right. Anything else to add before we wrap it up?
That's it. Thank you so much for bringing us back. We love being on here, and we love the community that you're building so much.
I appreciate it. Awesome. Yeah, it's all about extroverted intuition. I guess I'm your hero just because of my extroverted intuition. Never realized that. I'll take it. All right. Well, thanks a lot. And yeah, we'll do it again sometime, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much. We'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.